The candles never died in the undercroft. They had burned for 3 centuries without end, their flames fed not by wax but by something older, something that pulsed beneath the mountain like a second heartbeat. The cavern stretched impossibly high, its ceiling lost to darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. Stalactites hung like the fangs of some primordial beast, and the stone walls wept with moisture that never quite became water, never quite became blood. At the heart of this cathedral of darkness sat a throne. It was carved from obsidian and bone, its surface etched with names and languages that predated human memory. The armrests terminated in clawed hands that seemed to grip the stone beneath them, as if the throne itself might rise and walk should its occupant command it. Behind it, enormous stained glass windows depicted no holy scenes, only the phases of the moon rendered in blacks and crimsons and the deep purple of a bruise that would never heal. And upon that throne sat Seraphine, the vampire queen, the undying, the last crown of the blood moon court. She wore her immortality like others wore skin, naturally, unconsciously, with the casual grace of something that had never known an ending. Her gown was a masterwork of shadow and violence, black silk that moved like smoke, embroidered with patterns and threads so dark red it might have been rust, might have been dried blood, might have been something worse. The bodice was reinforced with plates of blackened steel shaped like ribs, like the exoskeleton of some elegant predator. The skirt fell in layers of gossamer darkness, each fold catching the candlelight and swallowing it whole. Her crown sat upon hair that cascaded past her shoulders in waves of absolute black, not the black of a raven's wing or a moonless night, but the black of the space between stars, of the void before creation. It was a simple circlet of twisted iron and onyx, unadorned save for 3 rubies the size of human eyes. Those who looked too long at those rubies swore they could see faces trapped inside, mouths open in eternal screams. But it was her face that truly held the power. Porcelain skin that had never known the sun stretched over features of such perfect symmetry they seemed almost inhuman, which of course they were. High cheekbones cast shadows beneath themselves. Lips the color of fresh spilled wine curved in an expression that was neither smile nor frown but something ancient and unreadable. And her eyes burned. Crimson irises ringed with gold, pupils that contracted to slits when she was hungry or amused or reminded of the centuries she had consumed. They were the eyes of something that had seen empires rise from nothing and collapse into dust. Eyes that had watched forests grow and die and grow again. Eyes that had loved and lost and learned not to love, because love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the only luxury an immortal could not afford. Behind her shoulders, folded against her back like the memory of flight, were wings. They were not the feathered wings of angels or the leathery wings of lesser vampires. These were something else entirely, vast membranes of darkness stretched over bones that seemed too delicate to support their span, yet strong enough to carry her through storms that would tear ships apart. When fully extended they could block out the moon. When folded, they created a cloak of living shadow that made her seem to merge with the darkness itself. She had not flown in 60 years. There had been no reason to. Everything she commanded came to her. The undercroft was the heart of her domain, and from here her influence spread like poison through clean water, subtle, unstoppable, inevitable. The network of caves and tunnels beneath the mountain connected to crypts and catacombs, to forgotten cellars and abandoned wells, to every dark place where her children could walk unseen. Above, in the world of daylight and human bustle, her agents moved through noble courts and merchant guilds, through monasteries and military camps, pulling strings so thin and numerous that the puppets never felt them. She had been ruling for 300 years. She would rule for 3,000 more. This was the certainty that had sustained her through the long dark. This was the truth she wore like armor beneath her gown. Immortality was not a gift. It was a discipline. It required the careful management of resources, the strategic cultivation of fear, the absolute suppression of anything that might make one hesitate, might make one weak. Anything like hope. Anything like mercy. Anything like love. Seraphine had excised those weaknesses from herself the way a surgeon removes a tumor, carefully, thoroughly, without sentiment. What remained was perfect. What remained was eternal. What remained was a queen who would never fall because she had nothing left to fall for. The candles guttered. She straightened on her throne, every sense suddenly alert. The flames had not moved in 300 years, and now they bent as if before a wind, though the air in the undercroft never stirred. The shadows at the far end of the cavern deepened, solidified, and then parted. Someone was coming. Her court of lesser vampires materialized from the darkness, 12 of them, her most trusted, her most deadly. They arranged themselves on either side of the throne like statues, their eyes reflecting the candlelight in shades of amber and scarlet and poisonous green. None of them spoke. None of them breathed. They simply waited, as they had learned to wait over the long centuries, for their queen to acknowledge the disturbance or destroy it. The footsteps were wrong. That was the first thing Seraphine noticed. They were too heavy, too irregular. No vampire walked with such graceless weight. No thrall or blood servant would dare approach the throne without crawling. These footsteps belonged to something that did not understand its place in the hierarchy of her domain. They belonged to something mortal. The figure emerged from the tunnel at the far end of the chamber, and Seraphine felt something she had not experienced in 2 centuries. Surprise. It was a man, unmistakably, undeniably human. He wore the practical clothes of a traveler, dark leather breeches, a shirt that had once been white but was now gray with road dust and rust brown with old blood. A cloak hung from his shoulders, torn in 3 places. His boots were scuffed and splitting at the seams. He carried no weapon that she could see, though the way he moved suggested he knew how to use one. But it was his wounds that arrested her attention. His left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly broken. Blood had soaked through his shirt on the right side, a deep wound recently sustained. His face bore the purpled evidence of bruising and his lower lip was split. One eye was swollen nearly shut. He walked with a limp that spoke of something wrong in his left leg, though whether it was broken or merely badly injured, she could not tell from this distance. He should not have been able to walk at all. He should have been dead. Yet he crossed the cavern floor with steady determination, each step an act of defiance against his body's betrayal. He did not cringe from the darkness. He did not cower before the assembled vampires, whose collective hunger filled the air like a physical presence. He did not fall to his knees when he reached the base of the throne. He simply looked up at her, and met her eyes. Seraphine's court hissed as one, a sound like steam escaping from a sealed tomb. No mortal looked directly at the vampire queen. It was not forbidden by law because it did not need to be. Instinct itself recoiled from that gaze, from the weight of centuries and power that could crush a human mind like parchment in a fist. But this man looked. His eyes were gray, not the gray of storm clouds or slate, but the gray of smoke, of ash, of things that had burned and been reduced to their essential elements. They held pain, exhaustion, determination, and something else. Something that made the dead space where Seraphine's heart had once beaten give a phantom flutter. Recognition. "You are Seraphine," he said. His voice was rough, damaged perhaps by screaming or smoke or the simple erosion of suffering. The undying queen. The blood crown. The eternal darkness. It was not a question. "You have walked through my domain without permission," Seraphine replied, her voice filling the cavern without needing to rise above a conversational tone. It was a voice that had ordered executions and pronounced judgments, that had whispered seductions and screamed defiance. "You have survived wounds that should have killed you. You stand before my throne without kneeling. Explain yourself, mortal, before I let my children paint the stones with what remains of your blood." The threat was not empty. Her court edged closer, circling the man like wolves around wounded prey. Their eyes had gone from reflective to luminous, and the points of their fangs showed beneath lips pulled back in anticipation. But the man did not flinch. "I am Matthias Kane," he said, "and I have come to offer you a trade." Seraphine laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It held no warmth, no humor, only the cold amusement of a predator encountering something too foolish to recognize its own death. The laugh echoed off the stone walls, multiplying until it seemed 100 queens were mocking this broken mortal from every shadow. "What could a dying human possibly offer me that I could not simply take?" she asked. "Your blood? I have oceans of it. Your service? I have armies of thralls more useful than you could ever be. Your knowledge? There is nothing new under the sun, and I have seen the sun rise and set 100,000 times. So tell me, Matthias Kane, what makes you believe you have anything to trade?" He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Seraphine saw him make a decision. Saw him weigh something in his mind, measure it against his wounds and his exhaustion and his impossible presence in her throne room, and find it adequate. I can offer you mortality, he said quietly. The cavern went absolutely still. Even the candle flames stopped their flickering. The assembled vampires froze mid-circle, their hunting instincts confused by a statement that made no sense. Seraphine herself felt the phantom flutter again, stronger this time, as if something long dead were trying to remember how to beat. Explain, she commanded. Matthias swayed slightly, his injuries finally catching up with his determination. But he locked his knees and remained standing. For 300 years you have been immortal. Untouchable. Beyond death, beyond time, beyond consequence. But immortality is not power, your majesty, it is a prison. You cannot die. Therefore you cannot risk, cannot truly choose, cannot change. You are as fixed and unchanging as this throne, this mountain, this eternal night. You speak of imprisonment, Seraphine said softly, dangerously. You who will die within days whether I kill you or not. You whose entire existence is a brief flicker between one darkness and another. You dare to call my eternity a prison? Yes, Matthias said simply. Because I have seen what it has made you. The wrongness of the statement hit her like a physical blow. He should not have said seen. He should have said heard, or learned, or been told. Seen implied observation, implied familiarity, implied. You have been watching me, Seraphine said. It was not a question, but Matthias answered anyway. For 5 years. 5 years. Impossible. Her network of spies and informants was absolute. No one observed her without her knowledge. No one survived in her domain without her permission. And yet this mortal stood before her claiming to have studied her for half a decade, and the certainty in his eyes suggested he was not lying. How? The word came out sharper than she intended. Carefully, Matthias replied. And at great cost. He gestured to his wounds with his functioning arm. Your sentries do not appreciate observers. But I learned to move through the spaces between your attention. To watch from the margins. To see what you let no one else see. And what did you see? Seraphine leaned forward on her throne, genuinely curious now. This man was insane, clearly, humans who obsessed over vampires always were. But there was a quality to his madness that intrigued her, a method to his suicidal boldness. Matthias met her eyes again, and this time she saw it clearly. Not just recognition. Not just determination. Sadness. I saw you sit on this throne for 14 days without moving, without speaking, without doing anything but staring into the darkness, he said quietly. I saw you walk through your own portrait gallery and not recognize yourself in paintings from a century ago. I saw you order the execution of a thrall who had served you faithfully for 30 years because he reminded you of someone you had once known, someone whose name you could no longer remember. Each word was a blade, precise and devastating. Seraphine's fingers tightened on the armrests of her throne, the stone beneath them cracking with the pressure. I saw you stand at the entrance to your own domain one night, Matthias continued, and watch the sun rise without moving forward, because you wanted to feel the sun again. Because you remembered just for a moment what it was like to be warm. Enough. Her voice was a whip crack, echoing through the cavern with enough force to scatter dust from the ancient stones. You have said quite enough, mortal. But Matthias was not finished. I saw an immortal queen who has lived so long she has forgotten how to live. Who has become a monument to herself. Who rules in eternal darkness because she is too afraid to step into the light. And I thought, he swayed again, caught himself. I thought perhaps she might want to remember what it means to be vulnerable again. To be human again. To be mortal. You thought wrong. Seraphine rose from her throne, her wings unfurling behind her in a cascade of shadow. She descended the 3 steps to the cavern floor, and her court parted before her like water before a ship's prow. She stopped 3 feet from Matthias, close enough to smell the blood on him, close enough to hear the labored beating of his failing heart. I am not afraid of mortality, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrible than her earlier shout. I conquered it. I transcended it. I destroyed it so thoroughly that death itself forgot my name. What you call fear, I call victory. What you call imprisonment, I call sovereignty. I am not trapped in immortality, I have built an empire from it. She reached out with one pale hand, her nails sharp enough to open his throat with the gentlest pressure. But she did not strike. Instead, she touched his face, the unmarred side where the bruising had not yet bloomed. Her fingers were cold, corpse cold, and Matthias shuddered at the contact. "You have watched me for 5 years," Seraphine continued. "You have learned my routines, mapped my domain, studied my weaknesses. And from this you concluded that I am lonely, that I am lost, that I hunger for the very mortality I shed like a snake's skin." She leaned closer, her crimson eyes filling his vision. "But you forgot to ask yourself one crucial question, Matthias Kane." "What question?" His voice was barely audible. "Why am I letting you live?" The question hung between them like a blade. Seraphine could feel his pulse hammering against her palm, could hear the sharp intake of breath as understanding dawned. She could have killed him the moment he entered her domain. She could have had her sentries tear him apart the first time he tried to spy on her. She could end him now with a thought. But she had not, would not, could not. And in that moment, staring into the smoke-gray eyes of a dying mortal who had somehow seen past her centuries of armor, Seraphine felt something she had not experienced in 300 years. Fear. Not fear of death, she had long since moved beyond that. Not fear of pain or loss or defeat. This was something more fundamental, more terrifying. It was the fear of being known. "You are correct," she said, releasing him and stepping back. Her wings folded against her back once more. "I have been lonely. I have been lost. I have ruled my darkness for so long that I no longer remember what I am ruling it for." She turned away from him, facing her throne, her court, the eternal candles that would burn long after even memory forgot her name. "But you are wrong about one thing," she continued. "I do not want to be mortal again. Mortality is not a gift I seek, it is a curse I inflicted on you. I condemned you to death, Matthias Kane, though I never touched you, never spoke to you, never knew your name until tonight. I condemned you simply by existing in a world you could not resist studying. Simply by being a mystery you felt compelled to solve." She looked back over her shoulder at him. "You say you can offer me mortality. But you have already given me something far more dangerous." "What?" Matthias asked. "A reason to want it." The admission hung in the air between them, impossible and true. Seraphine had spoken her weakness aloud, had given it form and substance. And now it could not be unspoken, could not be ignored, could not be crushed beneath the weight of centuries and sovereignty and cold immortal logic. Because this mortal, this dying man with his broken body and his smoke-gray eyes, had done the impossible. He had made her remember what it meant to be seen. Not as a queen. Not as a monster. Not as an eternal power beyond mortal comprehension. But as someone who could still feel. Could still want. Could still ache for something she had convinced herself she no longer needed. Connection. "You will stay," Seraphine commanded, her voice firming with decision. "My court will prepare chambers for you. You will be tended to, your wounds healed. And when you are strong enough to stand before me without swaying," she paused, considering, "we will continue this conversation." "And if I refuse?" Matthias asked. "Then you will die on the journey out of my domain," Seraphine replied matter-of-factly. "Your wounds are too severe. You have perhaps 6 hours before blood loss and infection claim you. The entrance to the Undercroft is 3 days' walk from here. The mathematics are not in your favor." She watched emotions war across his face. Pride, pragmatism, pain, and something else. Relief, perhaps. As if he had been hoping for exactly this outcome. "I accept your hospitality, your majesty," he said finally, and then his knees buckled. Seraphine moved without thinking, catching him before he hit the stone floor. His weight was nothing to her strength, but the warmth of him, the vivid, vital heat of human blood and living flesh, burned against her cold skin like fire. She could feel his heartbeat, erratic and weak, a mortal rhythm that would someday cease. Someday soon if she did not act. "Casimir," she commanded, and one of her court stepped forward, a thin vampire with scholar's hands and a surgical precision to his movements. "Take him to the East Chambers. Use whatever resources you need. I want him alive." "Yes, my queen," Casimir replied, gathering Matthias from her arms with the careful efficiency of someone who had preserved the dying before. "Though I must warn you, the wounds are severe. I can heal them, but the scarring will be extensive." "I did not ask you to make him beautiful," Seraphine said coldly. I asked you to keep him alive. She watched them disappear into the tunnels, Matthias unconscious in Casimir's arms, his blood leaving a trail of dark spots on the stone floor. When they were gone, she turned to face her remaining court. 11 vampires stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to concern to barely concealed hunger. They had questions. She could see them forming, could feel the pressure of unspoken words pushing against the centuries of discipline that kept them silent. Say nothing, she commanded. Think nothing. Question nothing. The mortal is under my protection. Anyone who touches him without my explicit permission will face the sun at dawn. Am I understood? Yes, my queen, they chorused and melted back into the shadows from which they had come. Seraphine stood alone in her throne room, surrounded by her candles and her darkness and the accumulated weight of 300 years. She looked at the trail of blood Matthias had left behind, small red witnesses to his passage, to his audacity, to his impossible presence in her domain. She knelt and touched one of the droplets with a fingertip. It was still warm, still human, still mortal. She brought the finger to her lips and tasted it, not from hunger but from curiosity. His blood was ordinary. No special properties, no hidden powers, nothing to explain why she had spared him. Nothing to justify the danger she had just invited into her eternal night. Nothing except the truth she had spoken. He had made her want mortality. Not to possess it, but to understand it. To remember it. To experience it through him, this dying man who had spent 5 years watching her forget how to live. Seraphine returned to her throne and sat, staring at the blood trail until her stillness became absolute, until she resembled nothing so much as a statue of a queen who had ruled too long and forgotten why she had wanted to rule at all. The candles burned. They would burn forever. But for the first time in 3 centuries, Seraphine wondered if forever was long enough. The east chambers had not been used in 80 years. They occupied a section of the undercroft that existed in a strange liminal space, not quite within Seraphine's throne room, not quite part of the outer tunnels. The rooms had been carved from the living rock by human slaves in the early years of her reign, before she had perfected the art of thraldom, when her rule still required the crude tools of chains and fear rather than the subtle bonds of blood and compulsion. Casimir carried Matthias through corridors that narrowed and widened without architectural logic, past doorways that led to chambers whose purposes had been forgotten centuries ago. Water dripped from the ceiling in places, forming pools that reflected nothing, not even the light from the phosphorescent lichen that grew in patches on the walls. The scholar vampire moved with the efficient grace of something that had long since ceased to be hindered by physical space. He did not hurry because hurrying implied urgency, and urgency implied that time mattered, which it did not to the undead. But neither did he dawdle because his queen had given him a task, and failure to fulfill a queen's command was the only true death a vampire could experience. The chambers themselves were surprisingly livable, considering their abandonment. Someone, perhaps the same slaves who had carved them, or perhaps one of the earlier generations of vampires who had not yet learned to sleep standing in the shadows, had furnished them with the basic necessities of human existence. A bed with a frame of dark wood and a mattress that, while ancient, remained intact. A table and chair. A wash basin, empty now but still functional. Even a narrow window, though it opened not to the outside world but to one of the deeper caverns, where the darkness was so complete it made no difference whether the window was open or shuttered. Casimir laid Matthias on the bed with the careful precision of a surgeon arranging a body for autopsy. The mortal was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin pale beneath the bruising and blood. The scholar vampire stepped back and assessed his patient with eyes that had studied anatomy long before modern medicine existed, that understood the human body not as a marvel of evolution but as a machine of meat and bone, intricate but ultimately simple. The wounds were severe but not immediately fatal. The broken arm, radius and ulna both fractured but clean breaks. The gash in his side, deep, missing the kidney by perhaps an inch, significant blood loss but the bleeding already slowing as clotting factors did their work. The leg, not broken, merely badly bruised, possibly a torn muscle. The head wounds, the split lip, the blackened eye, painful but superficial. He should have been dead. That was what interested Casimir. Not the wounds themselves, which were prosaic enough, but the sheer accumulation of damage that Matthias had sustained and yet continued to function through. The human body was remarkably resilient within certain parameters, but it also had limits. Pain alone should have rendered him unconscious long before he reached the throne room. Shock should have shut down his higher functions. The simple mechanics of a broken arm and a deep torso wound should have made it impossible to walk, let alone walk with the steady determination Casimir had witnessed. Unless he had been sustained by something other than flesh and bone. By will, perhaps. By obsession. By the kind of single-minded focus that could override the body's survival instincts and push it past the point where it should have failed. Casimir had seen it before, though not in many decades. Crusaders in the early years, driven by religious fervor to attack vampire enclaves with nothing but faith and steel. Lovers tracking their transformed beloveds into the night, armed only with grief and determination. Parents seeking vengeance for children taken by the blood. They all died, of course. Eventually. Will could take a human body far past its normal limits, but it could not rewrite the fundamental rules of biology. Blood loss killed. Infection killed. Shock killed. And in the end, mortality itself killed, because that was what mortality did. But Seraphine had ordered him kept alive. So Casimir set to work. He began with the immediate threats, cleaned the side wound with water drawn from a spring deep beneath the mountain, water that had never seen sunlight and thus retained a certain purity useful for medical applications. The gash was deep but relatively clean. No signs of infection yet, though that would come if left untreated. He pressed the edges of the wound together and held them there, using his supernatural stillness to maintain perfect pressure while the body's own healing factors began to knit the flesh. Vampires could not heal the living. Their blood was a poison, not a cure. But they could create conditions for healing, could use their strength and precision to do what human hands could not sustain. Casimir held the wound closed for an hour, unmoving, unbreathing, while Matthias's unconscious body struggled to repair itself. When he finally released the pressure, the wound had closed enough to no longer pose an immediate threat. It would scar badly, would leave Matthias with a permanent reminder of whatever violence had brought him to the Undercroft. But it would not kill him. The arm was more complex. Casimir felt along the length of it with fingers that could detect the hairline fractures in bone that would be invisible to human examination. Both the radius and ulna were broken, but the breaks were clean, the bones still aligned. He set them with the same inhuman patience he had used on the wound, holding the bones in perfect position while he fashioned a splint from pieces of wood pried from the ancient furniture. By the time he finished, Matthias had been unconscious for 3 hours. Casimir cleaned the facial wounds, assessed the damage to the eye, swollen shut but not permanently injured, and treated the myriad smaller injuries that covered the mortal's body like a map of violence. Each bruise told a story. Each cut suggested a weapon. The pattern of damage painted a picture of a man who had been hunted, cornered, beaten, and yet somehow had escaped to make his way here. To make his way to the Queen. That was the part that interested Casimir most. Not how Matthias had survived his injuries, but why he had expended such effort to reach Seraphine. What drove a mortal to seek an audience with death itself? What obsession could be strong enough to override survival instinct, pain, and simple common sense? Love? A voice said from the doorway. Casimir turned to find Seraphine standing at the threshold. She had moved so silently that even his enhanced senses had not detected her approach. But then, she was the Queen. If she did not wish to be noticed, she would not be. Your Majesty, Casimir said, bowing his head in deference. I did not hear you approach. You were distracted by your analysis, Seraphine replied. She stepped into the chamber, her gaze fixed on the unconscious mortal. I could feel you thinking from the throne room. What have you concluded? That he should be dead, Casimir answered honestly. The wounds are severe but survivable, if treated immediately, if the patient is strong, if luck favors him. But he walked for hours with these injuries. Possibly days. The pain alone should have rendered him unconscious, yet he remained functional enough to navigate the outer tunnels and find his way to your throne room. And why does this interest you? Because it suggests motivation powerful enough to override basic biology, Casimir said. And there are very few motivations that powerful. Vengeance is one. Religious fervor is another. He paused, looking at his queen. Love is the strongest. Seraphine said nothing for a long moment. She moved to stand beside the bed, looking down at Matthias with an expression Casimir could not quite read. It was not the cold assessment of a predator examining prey. It was not the casual disinterest of an immortal observing a mayfly's brief lifespan. It was something else, something Casimir had not seen on his queen's face in the century he had served her. It was recognition. He said he has been watching me for 5 years, Seraphine said quietly. 5 years of observation. 5 years of studying my patterns, mapping my domain, learning my habits. That is not the action of an assassin or a hunter. That is the action of someone trying to understand. Or someone trying to find a weakness, Casimir suggested carefully. Perhaps, Seraphine agreed. But if he sought a weakness to exploit, why reveal himself? Why walk into my throne room and offer a trade? Why not simply use whatever vulnerability he discovered? She reached out and touched Matthias's face, her fingers tracing the line of his unmarred cheek with a gentleness that seemed almost foreign to her nature. Because he does not want to destroy you, she continued. He wants to save you. The statement hung in the air between them, impossible and true. Casimir said nothing because there was nothing to say. He was a scholar, an observer, a preserver of knowledge. He understood the mechanics of biology and the patterns of behavior. But he did not understand this. Did not understand how a mortal could look at an immortal monster and see something worth saving. Did not understand how his queen, who had spent 3 centuries building walls of ice and darkness around whatever remained of her heart, could stand beside a dying human and touch him with something that looked almost like tenderness. Will he live? Seraphine asked. If he wishes to, Casimir replied. The wounds are treated. The immediate dangers addressed. But survival at this point is as much a matter of will as medicine. He must want to wake up. Must want to continue living. And I do not know if he does. He does, Seraphine said with certainty. He did not walk through my domain dying just to expire in a comfortable bed. He has something more to say. Something more to offer. She withdrew her hand from Matthias's face and turned to face Casimir fully. You will watch him, she commanded. You will ensure he recovers. And when he wakes, she paused, considering. You will send for me immediately. Yes, my queen. Seraphine moved toward the door, then stopped at the threshold. She looked back at the unconscious mortal, and Casimir saw something flicker across her face. Not quite emotion, she had armored herself too thoroughly for that. But the shadow of emotion, the ghost of something that might have been feeling in a creature that still possessed the capacity for such weakness. Casimir, she said. When did you last feel anything? The question surprised him. In a century of service, she had never asked anything so personal. Had never acknowledged that her court had once been human, had once possessed the full spectrum of mortal sensation. I do not remember, my queen, he answered truthfully. It has been a long time. Too long, Seraphine said quietly. We have been undead for so long that we have forgotten what it means to live. We move through eternity like stones in a river, unchanged by the flow of time, unaffected by the events around us. We have become monuments to ourselves. She looked at Matthias again. He remembers. He feels. He burns with something we can no longer access. And I find myself wondering. She stopped, shook her head. Watch him, Casimir. Keep him alive. That is all. Then she was gone, dissolving into shadow with the supernatural grace of her kind, leaving Casimir alone with the mortal and a growing sense of unease. Because he understood now what disturbed him about this situation. It was not that a mortal had survived the journey to the throne room. It was not that Seraphine had spared him. It was that in all his centuries of existence, in all his decades of observing his queen, Casimir had never seen her show genuine interest in anyone or anything. She ruled because ruling was her nature, survived because survival was her function. But she did not care. Had not cared in longer than he could remember. Until tonight. Until this broken mortal had walked into her throne room and told her she was imprisoned by her own immortality. Until Matthias Kane had made the undying queen want to be mortal again. Casimir settled into the chair beside the bed and prepared to wait. Waiting was something vampires excelled at. They had eternity to practice. He would watch over this mortal, would keep him alive as his queen commanded, and would try not to think about the implications of what he had witnessed. Would try not to wonder what would happen when Matthias woke. Would try not to consider what it might mean that after 3 centuries of ruling the darkness, Seraphine had finally found something in the light that she wanted to understand. The mortal's breathing steadied, deepened. His heartbeat, while still weak, found a more regular rhythm. His body, given the opportunity to rest and repair, began the slow work of healing itself. And in the darkness of the undercroft, in a chamber that had been empty for 80 years, a mortal slept while a vampire watched over him, and both of them were caught in the gravity of something far more dangerous than love or hate or death. They were caught in the orbit of possibility. The possibility that even eternal things could change. The candles continued to burn in the throne room. The mountain continued its slow geological drift. The world above spun through day and night, unconcerned with the small drama unfolding in the darkness beneath it. And in that darkness, something ancient stirred. Something that had been sleeping for 300 years. Something that might have been a heart. Matthias woke to darkness. Not the darkness of night, which carried with it the promise of dawn. Not the darkness of a closed room, which could be dispelled with a candle or a lamp. This was the darkness of being underground, of being buried alive in stone and time, of being so far from the sun that even the memory of light seemed like a fevered dream. He opened his eyes, or tried to. One opened. The other remained stubbornly shut, swollen and tender. The partial vision was disorienting, turning the world into a flat representation of itself, distance compressed into a single plane of gray-black shadows. Pain came next. It arrived not as a single sensation but as a symphony of different agonies competing for attention. His arm screamed in bright, sharp notes. His side provided a deep, throbbing bass line. His head contributed a dull, persistent rhythm that made thought difficult. The smaller injuries, the split lip, the bruised ribs, the torn muscles, added their own voices until the entire composition resolved into a single message. You are alive. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, against the natural conclusion of his wounds and his exhaustion and his impossible journey, he was alive. He turned his head, slowly, carefully, and saw a figure sitting in a chair beside the bed. Not Seraphine. This vampire was different, thinner, older, with the careful posture of a scholar who had spent centuries hunched over texts and specimens. His eyes were not the burning crimson of the queen but a cooler amber, sharp with intelligence and something that might have been curiosity. You are awake, the vampire observed. His voice was measured, clinical, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering diagnoses. This is earlier than I anticipated. Your will to continue living is remarkably strong. Matthias tried to speak, found his throat too dry to produce sound. The vampire rose, retrieved a cup of water from the table, and held it to Matthias's lips with surprising gentleness. The water was cold, tasting of minerals and stone and the deep earth. Matthias drank greedily until the vampire pulled the cup away. Slowly, the vampire advised. Your body has been through significant trauma. Overwhelming your system now would be counterproductive. He set the cup aside and settled back into his chair. I am Casimir. I have been tending to your wounds. How long? Matthias managed to rasp. 3 days, Casimir replied. You have been unconscious for 3 days. A reasonable response to the extent of your injuries, though I confess I had expected you to remain so for at least another day or two. He tilted his head, studying Matthias with the detached interest of a naturalist examining an unusual specimen. What drove you to wake so soon? Matthias closed his functioning eye, marshalling his thoughts. 3 days. He had been unconscious for 3 days, his body suspended in the healing darkness of the undercroft while the world above moved on without him. 3 days during which anything could have happened. 3 days during which Seraphine could have changed her mind, could have decided his presence was more trouble than it was worth, could have simply let him die in the cold comfort of these ancient chambers. But she had not. I made her a promise, Matthias said finally, opening his eye again. I told her I could offer her mortality. And I cannot keep that promise if I am dead. An interesting dilemma, Casimir observed. Though I must point out that your death would, in fact, demonstrate mortality quite effectively. Perhaps the most effective demonstration possible. Despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite everything, Matthias felt a smile tug at his split lip. That is not the kind of mortality she needs to see. And what kind does she need? The question was genuinely curious, without mockery or malice. Casimir leaned forward slightly, his amber eyes intent on Matthias's face, waiting for an answer that might explain the inexplicable situation in which they all found themselves. The kind that chooses, Matthias said. The kind that lives knowing it will die and finds meaning in that knowledge. The kind that makes every moment matter because there will not always be more moments. He shifted on the bed, biting back a gasp as the movement pulled at his side wound. She has forever. She has eternal security. She has power beyond mortal comprehension. And none of it means anything because she cannot lose it, cannot risk it, cannot choose to walk away from it. You speak as if immortality is a curse, Casimir said softly. Is it not? Matthias met the vampire's gaze with his single functioning eye. Tell me, Casimir, when did you last feel joy? True joy, not merely satisfaction or the pleasure of a task completed. When did you last feel fear? When did you last make a choice that mattered, that could not be undone, that would change everything? Casimir was silent for a long moment. In the darkness of the chamber, with only the faint phosphorescent glow of the lichen for light, his face was a mask of shadows and ancient thoughts. I do not remember, he said finally. It has been a very long time. That is the curse, Matthias said. Not death, not pain, not loss, but the slow erosion of everything that makes existence meaningful. You live forever, and in doing so you forget why you wanted to live at all. And yet humans fear death above all things, Casimir pointed out. They spend their brief lives in terror of the ending, grasping at any chance to extend their years. If they could choose immortality, most would take it without hesitation. Some would, Matthias agreed. Those who have not yet learned that length and meaning are not the same thing. But those who understand, truly understand, would choose mortality every time. Because it is the ending that gives the beginning its weight. It is the knowledge that we will die that makes us truly alive. He shifted again, managing to prop himself up slightly against the pillows. The effort left him breathless and sweating, but he needed to sit up, needed to face this conversation with something other than the vulnerability of lying flat. I watched her for 5 years, Matthias continued once he had caught his breath. I saw what immortality has done to her. She sits on her throne and rules her darkness, and it is perfect and eternal and completely meaningless. She has forgotten how to want anything except what she already has. She has forgotten how to fear anything except change. She has become a perfect, crystallized version of herself, unchanging and therefore unliving. You speak of my queen with remarkable presumption, Casimir said, though there was no heat in the words. One might think you were describing someone you knew intimately, rather than someone you observed from a distance. I watched her closer than you think, Matthias replied. I learned to move through the spaces between her attention, to be present but unnoticed. And in those spaces I saw things she does not let her court see. Moments when the mask slipped. Moments when the weight of forever became too heavy even for an immortal to bear. Such as. Matthias closed his eye, remembering. There is a chamber in the outer tunnels. Small, easy to miss. It contains nothing but a mirror, old, tarnished, the silver backing flaking away. I found her there once at what I think must have been near dawn in the world above. She was standing before that mirror, staring at her reflection. And she was crying. Casimir went very still. That is impossible. We do not. I know what vampires do and do not do, Matthias interrupted gently. I know the lore. I know the limitations. I know that you do not produce tears because you do not produce anything. No sweat, no saliva, no blood of your own. But she was crying anyway. Not tears, she has no tears to shed. But her face was contorted with the effort of trying to weep, and she was making sounds I hope never to hear again. The sounds of something that has been in pain for so long it no longer remembers what the pain is for. The scholar vampire rose from his chair and moved to the narrow window, staring out into the deeper darkness beyond. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. If what you say is true, and I am not conceding that it is, then you witnessed a moment of profound vulnerability. A moment my queen would not wish revealed. I know, Matthias said, and I have kept it secret for 3 years. I tell you now not to betray her trust, but to explain why I came. Why I risked death to stand before her throne and offer her something she did not know she needed. And what makes you think you can offer her anything? Casimir turned from the window, his amber eyes sharp in the darkness. You are mortal. Breakable. Brief. You will die, probably within the next 50 years, more likely within the next 5 if the stress of this obsession continues to wear on you. What could you possibly give to a queen who has everything and will continue to have everything long after your bones have turned to dust? I can give her a reason to care about tomorrow, Matthias said simply. I can give her something that might end. Something that requires choice. Something that will hurt her if it goes away, and therefore something that matters. The implication of his words settled over the chamber like a weight. Casimir stared at him, and for the first time since waking, Matthias saw something other than clinical interest in the vampire's face. He saw understanding. And beneath it, hidden but present, something that might have been pity. You intend to make her care for you, Casimir said quietly. To attach her affections to something mortal, something temporary, something that will inevitably be lost. You think that by experiencing the pain of losing you, she will remember what it means to feel. What it means to be vulnerable. What it means to be mortal. Yes, Matthias said. That is the cruelest thing I have ever heard, Casimir replied. And I have existed for over 200 years, during which time I have witnessed atrocities that would shatter mortal comprehension. But this, he shook his head. To deliberately cultivate love in someone who has spent centuries learning not to feel it, knowing that you will die and leave her with that wound, that is a special kind of brutality. I know, Matthias said, and the pain in his voice had nothing to do with his physical wounds. I know what I am doing. I know what it will cost her. But immortality is a worse cruelty, Casimir. It is a slow death by perfect preservation. She is dying by inches, 1 century at a time, and she does not even realize it because the death is so gradual. At least this way, his voice cracked. At least this way she will feel something real before the numbness takes her completely. And if she destroys you for it? Casimir asked. If she realizes what you are doing and tears you apart in fury at your presumption? Then I will die knowing I tried, Matthias said. And she will feel that fury which is more than she has felt in decades. Even in destruction, I will have given her a gift. Casimir moved back to his chair and sat, his posture that of a scholar who has just encountered a theorem that challenges everything he thought he understood. You are either the bravest mortal I have ever met, he said finally, or the most foolish. Possibly both. Probably both, Matthias agreed. He was exhausted, the brief conversation having depleted what little energy his healing body possessed. Will you tell her? About what I intend? I do not know, Casimir said honestly. The proper action would be to inform my queen that her newest guest represents a threat, not to her safety, but to her carefully maintained emotional isolation. The loyal action would be to suggest that you be removed before you can inflict any further damage to her peace. But you will not, Matthias said, and it was not a question. No, Casimir admitted. Because I remember standing in that throne room and watching her touch your face with something that looked almost like tenderness. And I realized that in a century of service, I had never seen her touch anyone that way. Never seen her lower her guard even for a moment. And I thought, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I thought perhaps you are right. Perhaps the cruelty of this gambit is less than the cruelty of allowing her to continue her eternal sleep. Thank you, Matthias said quietly. Do not thank me yet, Casimir replied. She will come to see you soon. She has been waiting for you to wake. And when she does, he rose from his chair. I hope you are prepared for what you have set in motion. Because once you begin this, there is no retreat. No changing your mind. No deciding that the cost is too high. You will see it through to the end, whatever that end may be. I know, Matthias said. I have known since the moment I decided to watch her. Since the moment I saw her standing at the edge of her domain, staring at a sunrise she could never touch. I have been committed to this ending from the beginning. Then rest, Casimir advised. Gather your strength. You will need it for what comes next. He moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold, looking back at the mortal who had come to break his queen's heart in order to save it. For what it is worth, Casimir said, I hope you succeed. I hope you give her something worth feeling, even if that feeling is pain. Because you are right about one thing, we have been dead for so long that we have forgotten how to live. And perhaps it takes a dying man to remind us. Then he was gone, leaving Matthias alone in the darkness with his wounds and his plans and the terrible certainty of what he was about to do. He settled back into the pillows, his body demanding rest even as his mind raced forward, planning the conversation to come. You would need to be careful. Precise. Seraphine was too intelligent to be manipulated crudely, too experienced to fall for obvious ploys. He would need to let her come to the realizations herself, to make her think that choosing to care was her own decision rather than his design. Would be delicate work. Dangerous work. Work that might fail at any moment and leave him with a painful death and her with nothing but confirmed isolation. But it was the only work worth doing. Because he had not lied when he told Casimir that he had been watching her for 5 years. Had not exaggerated when he described the moments when her mask slipped and the weight of eternity showed through. What he had not mentioned, what he would never mention to anyone, was that somewhere in those 5 years of observation, of learning her patterns and mapping her domain and studying her careful emotional architecture, he had made a terrible mistake. He had fallen in love with her. Not with the mask she wore. Not with the power she projected. Not with the immortal queen who ruled the darkness without fear or mercy or doubt. But with the woman who stood before a tarnished mirror and tried to weep without tears. With the creature who watched sunrises she could never touch. With the being who had lived so long she had forgotten how to live, and who suffered that forgetting in solitude because she had no one who could understand. He had fallen in love with her loneliness, and now he was going to save her from it, even if it destroyed them both in the process. Matthias closed his eye and let sleep take him once more. When he woke, she would be there. When he woke, the real work would begin. When he woke, he would start teaching an immortal queen how to be mortal again. And in doing so, he would give her the most precious gift he possessed. The certainty that it would end. She came at what Matthias judged to be the middle of the 4th night. He had been awake for hours, his body slowly rebuilding its reserves of strength, his mind running through conversations that might never happen. Casimir had visited twice more, once to change the dressing on his side wound, once to bring food and water that Matthias forced himself to consume despite his lack of appetite. The scholar vampire had said little during these visits, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. But now Casimir was gone, and Matthias was alone in the chamber when the shadows at the doorway condensed and became Seraphine. She did not enter immediately. She stood at the threshold, her crimson eyes reflecting the faint lichen light in shades of blood and fire, and simply looked at him. Matthias forced himself to meet that gaze, though every instinct screamed at him to lower his eyes, to show submission, to acknowledge the vast gulf of power between them. But if he showed submission now, he would never be anything more than another subject. Another thrall. Another brief distraction in an endless reign. So he held her gaze and waited. "You are healing," Seraphine observed finally. She stepped into the chamber, her wings folded tight against her back, her gown whispering across the stone floor like a dying breath. "Casimir says you woke earlier than expected. That your will to live is unusually strong." "I have things I still need to do," Matthias replied. His voice was steadier than he had expected, despite the pain that still sang through his body with every breath. "Such as?" "Keep my promise to you." Seraphine moved closer, stopping at the foot of the bed. In the dim light, she seemed less like a person and more like a work of art. Something sculpted from alabaster and obsidian and old blood, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "You promised to offer me mortality. I'm still waiting to understand what you meant by that. You cannot make me mortal. If such a thing were possible, I would have discovered it in 3 centuries of existence. And I doubt you possess some hidden magic that has eluded me." "I do not need magic," Matthias said. "I only need time." "Time?" A hint of amusement colored her tone. "Time is the one resource you do not have, Matthias Kane. You are mortal. You will be dead in decades, possibly sooner given your penchant for injuries. I, however, have all the time in existence. So explain to me how time helps your cause." Matthias pushed himself more upright, ignoring the sharp protest from his side. He needed to have this conversation from a position of at least partial equality, not lying flat like a patient or a corpse. "You misunderstand," he said. "I do not need time to make you mortal. I need time to show you what mortality means. To let you experience it through me. To give you something you have not had in 300 years. And what is that? A reason to count the days." The words hung in the air between them. Seraphine's expression did not change. It remained the careful mask of an immortal who had learned long ago not to react, not to reveal, not to give anything away. But Matthias saw the minute shift in her posture, the subtle tension in her shoulders. He had her attention. The difference between immortality and mortality is not death, Matthias continued. It is relevance. When you have forever, nothing is urgent. Nothing is precious. Nothing demands your immediate attention because you can always attend to it later. Tomorrow or next week or next century, it makes no difference when you have eternal time. And this is a problem? Seraphine asked, her tone carefully neutral. It is a tragedy, Matthias replied, because it means you never truly experience anything. You move through existence in a state of permanent deferral, never committing fully to any moment because there will always be more moments. You become a ghost in your own eternity, present but not engaged, alive but not living. He saw the words land, saw them strike something deep in her carefully armored psyche. She did not flinch, did not look away, but something shifted in the quality of her stillness. You presume to understand my experience, she said softly, and there was danger in that softness. You, who have existed for perhaps 3 decades, think you comprehend what it means to live for 3 centuries. That is either remarkably bold or fatally arrogant. Perhaps both, Matthias admitted. But I have had 5 years to observe you. 5 years to study how you move through your own eternity. And I know what I saw. What did you see? The question was a challenge, but beneath it, Matthias heard something else. Curiosity. The faint hope of someone who had been unseen for so long that being truly perceived was both terrifying and irresistible. I saw you visit the portrait gallery every year on the same night, Matthias said. The anniversary of your transformation, though you think no one remembers. I saw you stand before the painting of yourself from 50 years ago, and then the one from 100 years ago, and then the one from 200 years ago. I saw you study them as if they were portraits of strangers. As if you could no longer remember the person you were in each of those moments because they have all blurred together into one eternal present. Seraphine's hands tightened on the footboard of the bed. It was the first truly uncontrolled reaction he had seen from her. I saw you execute that thrall, Matthias continued, his voice gentle now careful. The one who had served you for 30 years. He called you by a name you used 2 centuries ago. A private name, I think, from before your reign. And you had him destroyed not because he was disloyal or incompetent, but because hearing that name reminded you of a version of yourself you could no longer access. Because remembering hurt worse than forgetting. Stop. The word was quiet but absolute. I saw you stand at the threshold of your domain and watch the sun rise, Matthias pressed on. You were so close to the light. Close enough that the first rays must have felt like heat on your skin. Close enough to remember what it was like to be warm. And you stood there for the entire sunrise, not retreating, not advancing, just existing in that liminal space between the darkness you rule and the light you can never touch again. I said stop. Her voice had not risen, but the temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees. Frost formed on the stone walls. The lichen light flickered and dimmed. But Matthias did not stop. You are so lonely, he said, and the words came out thick with emotion he had not meant to reveal. So desperately, profoundly lonely that you have convinced yourself loneliness is strength. That isolation is sovereignty. That the absence of connection is the same as the presence of power. But it is not. It is just emptiness wearing a crown. You know nothing about me, Seraphine said, but there was no force behind the words. They were the automatic denial of someone who had been cut too deep to immediately process the wound. I know enough, Matthias replied. I know that you are tired. I know that you are in pain. I know that you would welcome oblivion if you thought it would bring relief. But you cannot die, so you settle for the next best thing. You simply stop living. Stop feeling. Stop caring about anything except the maintenance of your eternal status quo. He met her eyes, and this time he let her see everything he felt. The love, the pity, the desperate determination to reach her before she crystallized completely into the monument of herself. But I can change that, he said quietly. I can give you days that matter. Moments that count. I can make you aware of time again, not as an infinite resource, but as something precious precisely because it is limited. My time. Our time. However much of it we have before my mortality claims me. And why would I want that? Seraphine asked. Why would I choose to care for something I know I will lose? Why would I attach myself to something as fragile and temporary as a human life? Because the alternative is worse, Matthias said. The alternative is continuing this eternal half-existence until you forget you were ever anything else. Until you become nothing but the function you perform, a queen without kingdom, a ruler without purpose, a being without being. He shifted forward despite the pain, leaning toward her with an intensity that made his wounds scream in protest. You asked me what I could offer you. This is it. Not mortality itself but the experience of it. The weight of days that will end. The urgency of moments that will not repeat. The terrible, beautiful knowledge that what we have together will not last forever, and is therefore more precious than anything immortal. Seraphine stared at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, her crimson eyes reflecting nothing of the storm that must be raging behind them. Then, slowly, she moved around the bed and sat on its edge, close enough that he could feel the cold that radiated from her body. You are asking me to love you, she said flatly. That is what this entire elaborate argument reduces to. You want me to care for you, to value our time together, to experience the pain of your eventual loss. You have dressed it up in philosophy and observation, but at its core, you are simply asking for something every mortal wants, to matter to someone more powerful than themselves. Yes, Matthias said simply. I'm asking you to love me. Or at least to let yourself be open to the possibility of loving me. Because in doing so, you will remember what it means to be vulnerable. To have something to lose. To care about a future that is not guaranteed. And when you die? Seraphine asked. When your brief candle burns out and I am left alone again with centuries ahead of me and the fresh memory of what I lost. What then? Do you think that will be a gift? Do you think I will thank you for reminding me of everything I gave up when I chose immortality? I think you will grieve, Matthias said honestly. I think it will hurt worse than anything you have experienced in 300 years. I think you will wish you had never met me, never allowed yourself to care, never opened yourself to this wound. He reached out with his uninjured hand and very carefully touched her face. She did not pull away. But I also think that grief will be the most real thing you have felt in centuries, he continued. And I think that after the pain fades, and it will fade eventually, you will find that you remember how to feel other things too. Joy, fear, hope, anger. All the messy, complicated, impossible emotions that make existence something more than just endless time. You will remember how to live, Seraphine. And that will be worth the pain of losing me. She closed her eyes, an oddly human gesture from something that had not been human for 3 centuries. When she opened them again, they held something Matthias had not seen before. Tears. Not the physical tears she could not produce, but the ghost of them. The emotion of weeping without the mechanism. Her face remained dry, but her eyes held an ocean of grief, and for just a moment, the mask fell away completely. I do not know if I can do this, she whispered. I do not know if I remember how to care. It has been so long, Matthias. So long since I allowed myself to want anything except what I already had. What if I cannot? What if I have become too crystallized, too perfectly preserved in my immortal isolation? What if you are offering me something I no longer have the capacity to accept? Then we will discover that together, Matthias said. And at least you will have tried. At least you will know that you made the attempt, rather than spending the next 1,000 years wondering if you could have been different. Seraphine looked at him, really looked at him with the full weight of her attention, her power, her accumulated centuries. And Matthias felt the pressure of that gaze like a physical force, assessing, measuring, stripping away every defense until she could see the truth of him. She saw his love, he knew, saw his plan. Saw his manipulation and his genuine emotion all tangled together in a way that made them inseparable. Saw that he was using her loneliness against her, but also that he truly believed this was the kindest cruelty he could inflict. You are a dangerous man, Matthias Kane, she said finally. More dangerous than any hunter or hero or holy warrior who has ever entered my domain. Because they sought to destroy my body, but you seek to destroy something far more fundamental. You seek to destroy my certainty. My careful equilibrium. My hard-won immunity to feeling. Yes, Matthias agreed. I do. And you think this is mercy? I think this is love. The word hung between them, impossible and true. Seraphine stared at him and he stared back, and in that moment of perfect mutual understanding, something fundamental shifted. She leaned forward, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away. When he did not, she pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy so human, so warm, so desperately vulnerable that it hurt to witness. "If I do this," she whispered, her cold breath ghosting across his face, "if I allow myself to care for you, to count the days of your mortality, to experience time through your limited perspective, it will destroy me when you die. It will break something in me that 3 centuries have not been able to touch. You understand this?" "I understand," Matthias said. "And you still ask this of me?" "I do." "Why?" The word was barely audible. "Why would you ask me to suffer so?" "Because suffering means you are still capable of feeling," Matthias replied. "And feeling means you are still alive. And being alive, truly alive, is worth any amount of pain." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, her forehead still pressed against his, their breaths mingling in the cold air of the chamber. Then she pulled back, and when she looked at him, her expression had changed. The mask was not entirely gone, she had worn it too long to shed completely. But it had shifted, cracked, become something less perfect and therefore more real. "Very well," she said. "I will accept your offer, Matthias Kane. I will let myself experience mortality through you. I will count the days of your life and value them as you insist they should be valued. I will open myself to the possibility of caring for something that will end." She stood, her wings unfurling slightly behind her. "But understand this, when you die, when your brief candle finally burns out and I am left alone with the wound you have inflicted, I will remember this conversation. I will remember that you chose this pain for both of us, and I will hate you for it even as I grieve you." "I understand," Matthias said. "I hope you do," Seraphine replied. She moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold, looking back at him. "Rest. Heal. Grow strong again. Because I will not care for someone too weak to survive the caring. If we are going to do this, if we are going to teach an immortal what it means to be mortal, then you must be strong enough to withstand the weight of my attention." "I will be," Matthias promised. She nodded once, then dissolved back into shadow, leaving him alone with his wounds and his victory and the terrible knowledge of what he had just set in motion. He had done it. He had convinced the vampire queen to care. He had opened a crack in her armor that would widen with time, that would let feeling seep back into a heart that had been frozen for 3 centuries. He had given her something to lose, and in doing so, had given her a reason to value what she had. But he had also condemned her to pain. Had guaranteed that when his mortality claimed him, sooner rather than later, given his injuries and the dangerous path he walked, she would suffer as she had not suffered in centuries. Would grieve. Would ache. Would remember what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. It was the cruelest kindness he could imagine. And it was absolutely necessary. Because an immortal who felt nothing was not truly alive, no matter how many centuries she accumulated. But an immortal who had loved and lost would remember what it meant to be alive, even in the midst of her grief. Matthias settled back into the pillows, his body demanding rest even as his mind raced with plans and fears and the bitter certainty of his own ending. He had perhaps a year, maybe 2, before the accumulated damage to his body claimed him. Maybe less if complications from his wounds set in. Maybe more if fate was kind. But however much time he had, he would spend it teaching Seraphine how to be mortal again. Teaching her to count days. To cherish moments. To feel the urgency of a life that would not last forever. And when he died, when the last of his time ran out and he left her alone in her eternal darkness, she would grieve. But she would also remember. Remember what it meant to live. Remember what it meant to love. Remember what it meant to be something more than just an immortal throne and a perfect mask and an endless, empty eternity. That remembering would be his gift to her. His legacy. His love. Matthias closed his eyes and let sleep claim him, a small smile on his split lip despite everything. He had come to the Undercroft dying. But he would leave it having saved a queen. Even if that salvation destroyed them both. The next 3 months passed in a rhythm that was at once strange and natural. Matthias healed slowly, his mortal body rebuilding itself with the inefficient determination of organic life. Casimir supervised the recovery with clinical precision, changing dressings, monitoring for infection, ensuring that the broken bones set properly. The scholar vampire never commented on the philosophical implications of his work, the irony of an immortal laboring to preserve a brief mortal life. But sometimes Matthias caught him watching with an expression that suggested he was thinking exactly that. Seraphine came every night. Not immediately after waking, not at any predictable hour, but sometime during the long darkness when the mortal world above would have been asleep. She would appear at the threshold of the chamber, her wings folded tight, her crimson eyes reflecting whatever dim light was available, and she would simply be there. At first she maintained a careful distance. She would sit in the chair Casimir had occupied during the healing vigils, her posture perfect, her expression controlled. She would ask about his recovery with the polite interest of a monarch inquiring after a subject's health. Nothing more intimate than that. Nothing that suggested she had accepted his offer or opened herself to the possibility of caring. But Matthias noticed the small things. He noticed that her visits grew longer each night, stretching from a few minutes to an hour, then 2 hours, then sometimes until Casimir arrived to insist Matthias needed rest. He noticed that the questions became less formal, less about his physical condition and more about other things. His past, his thoughts, his reasons for choosing this dangerous path. He noticed that she began to arrive with things, not gifts exactly, but small objects that suggested she had been thinking about him during the hours between visits. A book of poetry from her library, its pages yellow with age but its binding still intact. A chess set carved from black and white marble, with pieces so detailed they seemed to breathe. A small painting in a tarnished frame, depicting a sunrise she must have witnessed centuries ago, before her transformation. "I thought you might appreciate seeing what you can never see yourself," she said when she brought that last offering. "Since you have condemned yourself to my darkness." "I appreciate it," Matthias had replied, studying the painting's careful rendering of dawn light. "But I did not condemn myself. I chose this." "Those are not always different things," Seraphine observed. The conversations deepened with each visit. Matthias told her about his life before the Undercroft. His childhood in a small village that no longer existed, his training as a scholar, his growing fascination with the folklore of immortals. He explained how that fascination had become obsession, how obsession had become a quest, how the quest had led him to spend 5 years mapping her domain and learning her patterns. "I was not always this person," he admitted one night, when his arm had healed enough to move without pain and his side wound had closed to an angry scar. "I was a quiet man once. A careful man. Someone who lived in books and theories rather than risks and reality. But studying you changed me. Watching you changed me. I became someone who could walk into a vampire's throne room because I could not bear to see you suffer alone anymore." "And now?" Seraphine asked. "Are you still that changed person? Or are you reverting to your careful scholar's nature now that you have achieved your goal?" "I do not know yet," Matthias said honestly. "I think perhaps I am becoming someone new entirely. Someone shaped by this." He gestured at the chamber, at the two of them, at the impossible situation they had created. "Whatever this is." "Whatever this is," Seraphine repeated softly. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Then, "Tell me what you miss most. About the world above." The question surprised him. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I am trying to understand," she said. "You have asked me to experience mortality through you, to value time as you value it. But I cannot do that if I do not understand what you are giving up by staying here. What you are sacrificing by binding yourself to my darkness." Matthias considered the question carefully. What did he miss? The sun, obviously, the warmth on his face, the way light turned the world into something bright and knowable. The seasons changing. Right. What? The simple freedom of moving through open spaces without the weight of stone above and around him. But those were the obvious answers. The surface answers. "I miss the sound of birds," he said finally. Specifically the sound of them waking. That moment just before dawn when the first bird begins to sing, and then another joins in and another, until the whole world is alive with their voices. It is the sound of beginning, of potential, of a day that has not yet been ruined by the complications of living it. Seraphine listened with absolute focus, the kind of attention she probably once gave to matters of state or military strategy. "And you will never hear that sound again as long as you remain here." "No," Matthias agreed. "But I will hear other things. The sound of water dripping in the deep caverns. The sound of your wings when you unfold them. The sound of your voice when you forget to be careful and let it carry emotion instead of just information. My voice does not carry emotion, Seraphine protested, but there was something in her tone that suggested she knew it was a lie. It does when you are angry, Matthias said. And when you are amused. And, he paused, then decided to risk it. And when you are afraid. I am not afraid of anything, she said automatically. You are afraid of me, Matthias replied gently. Not of what I can do to you physically, I am no threat to your safety. But of what I am doing to your careful emotional architecture. You are afraid that I am succeeding. That you are beginning to care despite yourself. That you are counting the days now, noticing time in a way you have not noticed it in centuries. Seraphine stood abruptly, her wings flaring slightly in agitation. She moved to the narrow window, staring out into the deeper darkness beyond. When she spoke, her voice was tight with suppressed feeling. You presume a great deal. I only observe, Matthias said. You have been visiting me every night for 3 months. You bring me things. You ask me questions. You stay longer each time. These are not the actions of someone who is indifferent. They are the actions of someone fulfilling her word, Seraphine countered, but without much force. I agreed to experience mortality through you. To let myself be open to caring. That requires observation. Engagement. I am simply following through on my commitment. Is that all it is? Matthias asked. Seraphine turned from the window, and in the dim light, he saw that her mask had cracked again. The emotion showing through was complex. Anger and fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. I do not know, she admitted. I do not know how to distinguish between genuine feeling and the mere memory of feeling. Between caring and simply going through the motions of caring. I have been pretending for so long that I no longer know where the pretense ends and reality begins. Matthias pushed himself out of bed. He was strong enough now to walk, though it still pulled at his healing wounds. He crossed the small chamber to where she stood and very carefully took her hand. It was cold, of course. Corpse cold. The flesh of something that had no blood to warm it, no heartbeat to circulate life through its limbs. But it was also real, solid, present. He held it gently, feeling the supernatural strength contained in those delicate fingers, the power that could crush his bones with a casual flex. Then let me help you distinguish, he said. When I hold your hand like this, when my warmth touches your cold, what do you feel? Seraphine stared at their joined hands, her crimson eyes intense with concentration. I feel texture, temperature differential, the fragility of your bones beneath thin skin. Those are observations, Matthias said. Not feelings. Try again. What do you feel? She was silent for a long moment, and he watched emotions flicker across her face. Frustration, confusion, something that might have been fear. Then very quietly. I feel aware of where we are touching. Conscious of it in a way that seems out of proportion to the simple physical contact. It is distracting. I find myself thinking about it during the hours when I am not here. Wondering if we will touch again when I return. Anticipating it. That is feeling, Matthias said gently. That anticipation. That awareness. That is what it means to care. It is terrifying, Seraphine whispered. Yes, Matthias agreed. Caring always is. Because anticipation can become disappointment. Awareness can become pain. Contact can be broken. That is the nature of valuing something mortal. It carries the constant threat of loss. I do not know if I can bear it, she said. You can, Matthias assured her. You have borne 3 centuries of isolation. You have survived the slow crystallization of your own immortality. If you can bear that, you can bear this. The fear of feeling is not worse than the numbness of not feeling. It is just different. Seraphine looked up at him, and for the first time since they had met, her expression was completely unguarded. No mask. No careful control. Just raw, honest vulnerability. What if I do this wrong? She asked. What if I damage you by learning to care? What if I am too cold, too inhuman, too broken by my immortality to do this properly? Then you will damage me, Matthias said simply. And I will heal or I will not. And we will continue anyway because the alternative is worse. The alternative is you returning to your throne and your darkness and your eternal half-existence, and me dying knowing I failed to reach you. He squeezed her hand gently. You will make mistakes, Seraphine. You will hurt me. You will say the wrong things and do the wrong things, and sometimes you will retreat back into your armor because it feels safer than being vulnerable. But none of that matters as long as you keep trying. As long as you keep showing up to these chambers night after night and attempting to remember what it means to connect with someone. You ask a great deal of me, she said. I know, Matthias replied. But you are capable of great things. You ruled a domain for 3 centuries. You commanded armies of the undead. You bent the darkness itself to your will. Surely learning to care for one dying mortal is not beyond your abilities. Despite everything, she smiled, just a small curve of her lips but genuine. You are infuriating. Yes, Matthias agreed, smiling back. But you keep visiting anyway. I do, Seraphine acknowledged. She looked at their joined hands again, studying them as if they were a puzzle she could solve through careful observation. I have been counting, she said suddenly. Counting what? Days. Since you arrived. Since you woke. Since we began this. She paused, searching for the right word. This experiment in mortality. I've been marking them. Noting how many have passed. Anticipating how many remain. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I have not counted days in 200 years, Matthias. I moved through time without measuring it, without marking its passage. But now I count. Every sunset I do not see. Every night you grow stronger. Every hour until I can return to this chamber and continue learning how to feel. She met his eyes and he saw tears there again. The ghost tears she could not shed, the emotion without mechanism. You have succeeded, she said. Whatever you set out to do, whatever change you hope to create, it is happening. I am counting the days. And it terrifies me because I know that someday, soon in mortal terms, those days will run out. Yes, Matthias said quietly. They will. And when they do, when you die and leave me alone with this newfound ability to feel, what then? What do I do with all this counting when there are no more days of yours to count? It was the question he had been dreading. The question he had no good answer for because the truth was terrible. I do not know, he admitted. Perhaps you will continue counting other things. Other people. Other mortal lives that cross your path. Perhaps you will use what you learned from losing me to connect with others, to build relationships that matter even though they will end. Or perhaps, he paused, considering, perhaps you will simply carry the grief. Hold it as proof that you were capable of loving something enough to hurt when it was gone. Either way you will have this proof that you are more than just eternal. That you are alive. Seraphine pulled her hand from his and stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture that was achingly human. I am not certain that is a gift. Neither am I, Matthias said honestly. But it is the only gift I have to give. My mortality. My time. My inevitable ending. And the hope that experiencing them will teach you something worth knowing. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything they had acknowledged hanging heavy in the cold air. Then Seraphine straightened, her wings settling against her back, her mask beginning to reconstruct itself. But it did not fit quite as well as it had before. The cracks were visible now, the vulnerability showing through despite her attempt to hide it. I should go, she said. You need rest. Casimir says you are healing well, but you should not overtax yourself. Will you come tomorrow night? Matthias asked. Tomorrow night and the night after and every night until... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Until there are no more nights, Matthias completed quietly. Yes, Seraphine agreed. Until then. She moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold. Without turning back, she spoke one more time. Thank you. For what? Matthias asked, surprised. For seeing me, Seraphine said. For watching me for 5 years and seeing not just the monster or the queen or the immortal power, but the person beneath all that. For caring enough to try to save me from my own eternity. No one has done that before. No one has ever bothered to look close enough to realize I needed saving. Then she was gone, dissolved into shadow, leaving Matthias alone with the echo of her words and the knowledge that he had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. She was feeling again. She was counting days. She was alive in a way she had not been alive in centuries. And when he died, when his borrowed time ran out and he left her alone with the wound he had inflicted, she would grieve. But she would also remember. Remember this. Remember him. Remember what it meant to care for something mortal. And perhaps someday she would find another mortal worth counting days for. Another brief life worth valuing. Another chance to be alive rather than merely undying. That possibility was his real gift to her. Not his death, but the pattern it would create. The template for connection. The proof that even an immortal could learn to love mortal things. Matthias returned to his bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him. As he drifted towards sleep, he found himself counting too. Counting nights. Counting conversations. Counting the days they had left before his mortality claimed him. And finding them more precious than any eternal life could ever be. The seasons changed in the world above, though no hint of their passing reached the Undercroft. Matthias knew this only because Casimir mentioned it during one of his medical examinations. A casual comment about autumn giving way to winter, about the first snows falling on the mountain. The scholar vampire seemed surprised by his own observation, as if he too had fallen into the habit of counting days, of marking time's passage in a way vampires typically did not. "You are fully healed," Casimir pronounced, examining the scar on Matthias's side. The wound had closed completely, leaving only a raised line of tissue that pulled slightly when Matthias moved. "At least as healed as you will ever be. The scars are permanent, of course. And you have lost some range of motion in the arm where it broke. But you will not die from these injuries." "What will I die from?" Matthias asked. It was not a morbid question, just practical. He needed to know how much time he had. Casimir was quiet for a moment, his amber eyes thoughtful. "Honestly, I do not know. You are stronger than you should be, given what you survived. Your body is recovering remarkably well. If you were to leave the Undercroft now, return to the surface, live a careful life, you might have decades left." "But I will not leave," Matthias said. "No," Casimir agreed. "You will stay here, in the darkness, breathing air that has no freshness to it, eating food that must be brought from the surface, never seeing the sun or feeling natural warmth. That will exact its own toll. You are mortal. You need light. You need the things that grow in light. Without them," he shrugged. 5 years perhaps. Maybe 10 if you are extraordinarily lucky and careful. 5 years. It was longer than Matthias had expected, honestly. When he had walked into the Undercroft, he had been prepared to die within months. The fact that he might have years now seemed almost generous. "Does she know?" Matthias asked. "Have you told her?" "I have told her what I just told you," Casimir said. "That you are healed from your injuries, but the environment itself will slowly kill you." She did not respond well. "What did she do?" "She went to her throne and sat there for 3 days without moving," Casimir replied. "Not speaking. Not feeding. Not acknowledging her court. Just sitting. Thinking. When she finally moved again, she ordered the creation of gardens." "Gardens?" Matthias was confused. "Underground gardens?" "Gardens that can exist in darkness," Casimir clarified. "She has commanded her court to build chambers where food can be grown using alchemical lights. Not sunlight, but something close enough to sustain plant life. She is importing soil from the surface, seeds, everything necessary to create a sustainable ecosystem within the Undercroft." He looked at Matthias with something that might have been admiration. "She is trying to extend your life. Trying to give you the things you need to survive longer in her darkness." The implication hit Matthias like a physical blow. She was reshaping her domain for him. Investing resources, time, effort into creating conditions where he might live longer. Not to extend his suffering, but because she wanted more days with him. Because she was counting and the count was too short. That is, Matthias struggled for words. "That is extraordinary. That is love," Casimir corrected quietly. "Or the closest thing to it that a creature like her can manage. You have succeeded, Matthias Kane. You set out to teach an immortal to feel, and you have succeeded beyond measure. She cares for you. Deeply. Perhaps dangerously." "Dangerously?" Matthias asked. "What do you think she will do when you die?" Casimir asked. "When, despite her gardens and her efforts and her desperate attempt to extend your mortality, you finally succumb to the simple fact of being human in a place where humans were not meant to exist. What do you think happens to a queen who has learned to count days when the days suddenly run out?" Matthias had no answer. He had planned for many things, but he had not fully considered what his death would do to her. He had focused on the idea that grief would make her feel alive, that the pain of loss would be evidence of her capacity for love. But he had not truly thought through what that grief might drive her to do. "I do not know," he admitted. "Neither do I," Casimir said. "But I fear it, because she is not a creature built for grief. She is built for power, for control, for absolute dominion over her environment. And grief is the one thing that cannot be controlled or dominated. It simply is. It exists despite every effort to suppress it." He gathered his medical supplies with careful precision. "You have given her a gift, Matthias, but you have also given her a curse. And I hope you are prepared for what that curse will demand of her when you are gone." After Casimir left, Matthias sat alone with his thoughts. 5 years. Maybe 10. It was not a lifetime, but it was something. Something he could use. Something he and Seraphine could build with, if they were careful. They were brave. That night, when she came, he told her about his conversation with Casimir. "I know," she said simply. She was sitting in her usual chair, her wings folded, her posture perfect. But there was something in her eyes, a weight, a knowledge, a pain that had not been there before. "I know how long you have." I asked him to give me the truth, not the hopeful estimate. "And the gardens?" Matthias asked. "Are they real?" "They are being built as we speak," Seraphine confirmed. 3 chambers in the eastern caverns, large enough to sustain agriculture. My court is installing the alchemical lights, a process that requires significant resources and expertise, but we have both. Within a month we will have the capability to grow food here, to provide you with the nutrition you need to survive longer. "Why?" Matthias asked, even though he knew the answer. "Because I am not ready for you to die," Seraphine said bluntly. "Because I have only just learned to count the days and the count is already too short. Because," her voice cracked just slightly, "because I am afraid of what comes after." Matthias rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat. He knelt in front of her, bringing himself to eye level, and took both her hands in his. "I am afraid too," he admitted. "I am afraid of dying. Of leaving you. Of what my death will do to you after you have finally learned to feel again. But I am more afraid of not having done this. Of not having tried. Of living a safe, careful life and never knowing what it would be like to love someone as extraordinary as you." "I am not extraordinary," Seraphine protested. "I am a monster who has learned to pretend at humanity for a few months. That is not the same as being human." "No," Matthias agreed. "But it is the same as being alive. You have feelings now, Seraphine. Real feelings. You care about my life. You dread my death. You are making desperate plans to extend time that cannot truly be extended. Those are not the actions of a monster. Those are the actions of someone who has learned to love." She pulled her hands from his and stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I do not love you," she said, but there was no conviction in it. "I am interested in you. Invested in your continued existence. That is not the same as love." "What do you think love is?" Matthias asked gently. "I do not know," Seraphine admitted, her back still to him. "I have not loved anything in 300 years. I barely remember what it felt like before my transformation. It is like trying to recall a dream from childhood. I know it existed, but the details are gone." "Then let me tell you what love looks like from where I am standing," Matthias said. "Love is visiting someone every night even when you have a kingdom to rule. Love is building gardens in darkness because the person you care for needs light to survive. Love is counting days you never counted before because suddenly those days contain something precious. Love is being terrified of an ending because it means losing something that matters more than your own eternity." He moved to stand beside her, both of them staring out into the deeper darkness. "You love me, Seraphine. You may not recognize it, may not know what to call it, but you love me. And I love you. And we have perhaps 5 years to explore what that means before my mortality ends the experiment." "5 years?" she repeated softly. "It sounds like such a long time when you say it that way. 1,825 days. Give or take. But it is not long, is it? Not compared to the centuries I have already lived. Not even compared to a normal human lifespan. It is nothing. A blink. A breath." "It is everything," Matthias countered. "Because it is all we have. And knowing that makes every day precious. Every conversation meaningful. Every touch something to be treasured." He took her hand again, and this time she did not pull away. That is what mortality offers that immortality cannot. Not more time but urgent time. Time that demands to be valued because it will not wait. Seraphine turned to look at him, her crimson eyes searching his face. And when it is gone? When you are gone? What do I do with all this urgency and preciousness and desperate counting when there is nothing left to count? You remember, Matthias said. You remember that you were capable of it, that you loved something enough to grieve its loss. And perhaps, if you are brave, you find another mortal worth counting days for. Another brief life worth valuing. You do not replace me, grief does not work that way. But you honor what we had by allowing yourself to connect with others. By refusing to return to the crystallized isolation of your throne. You ask me to make a promise I do not know if I can keep, Seraphine said. I ask you to try, Matthias replied. That is all. To try to continue living rather than merely existing. To honor my memory by remaining alive in the way you have learned to be alive with me. She was quiet for a long moment, her cold hand in his warm one, both of them suspended between the present moment and the inevitable future. Then, very carefully, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, that gesture of intimacy she had used once before, in the early days when she had first admitted she might be capable of caring. I will try, she whispered. When you are gone, when the grief comes, and it will come, I can feel it already, waiting like a storm on the horizon, I will try to remember that feeling is better than numbness. That pain is proof of life. That counting days gave them meaning even if the count ran out. That is all I ask, Matthias said. They stood like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together, hands clasped, breathing the same cold air in the darkness beneath the mountain. Two beings who should never have connected. Immortal and mortal, predator and prey, eternal darkness and brief light, learning together what it meant to love something you knew you would lose. Outside the chamber, the undercroft continued its eternal existence. The candles burned. The mountain stood. The world above spun through seasons that would never touch this place. But in that small room, in that suspended moment, time moved differently. It moved with purpose. With meaning. With the terrible, beautiful urgency of knowing it would end. And for the first time in 300 years, Seraphine understood what it meant to be alive. Not undying. Alive. Counting the days. Dreading the end. Treasuring the middle. Living. The gardens grew. It took 6 weeks to complete the chambers, to install the alchemical lights that cast their cold blue glow over soil transported from the surface. Another 2 weeks to plant the first seeds and coax them into growth. Matthias watched the process with fascination, spending hours in the growing rooms as delicate shoots pushed through dark earth, reaching toward light that was not quite sunlight but close enough to fool them into living. It was strange seeing green things in the darkness. Strange and wonderful and deeply sad, because they existed only to extend his life, only to give him a few more months or years before the inevitable conclusion. But he tended them anyway. He watered them, pruned them, spoke to them in the quiet moments when he was alone. Because they were alive, and they were trying, and that deserved acknowledgement even if their purpose was borrowed from his mortality. Seraphine came to the gardens too, though she had no practical reason to. She would stand at the edge of the chambers, watching him work among the plants, her expression unreadable. They are thriving, she observed one evening. Casimir says the yield will be sufficient to sustain you indefinitely, as long as we maintain the lights and the soil conditions. Indefinitely is a strong word, Matthias replied, brushing soil from his hands. They will extend my life but not prevent its ending. Humans are not made for underground existence, no matter how well you compensate for the lack of sun. I know, Seraphine said quietly. But I can give you years instead of months. That is something. It is everything, Matthias agreed. He crossed to where she stood, careful not to track soil onto the clean stone floor beyond the garden chamber. Thank you. For this. For trying. I am not trying, Seraphine said, but there was no conviction in her denial. I am merely optimizing resources. Ensuring the continued viability of a project I have invested significant time in. You are trying to keep me alive because you love me, Matthias corrected gently. You can call it optimization or resource management or whatever clinical term makes it easier to acknowledge. But that is what it is. She did not deny it this time. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, soft, vulnerable, almost human. When did I become this person? She asked. When did I go from being a queen who felt nothing to someone who builds gardens to extend a mortal's life? When did I start counting days and dreading endings and feeling all these impossible things? When you decided to let yourself, Matthias said. When you chose vulnerability over invulnerability. When you accepted my offer to experience mortality. I am not certain I like it, Seraphine admitted. This feeling. This constant awareness of time passing, of endings approaching. It is exhausting. It is painful. I understand now why mortals seem so frantically desperate in their brief lives. They are running a race against an invisible finish line, and they know they will lose. Yes, Matthias agreed. But the running matters. The effort matters. The fact that we lose in the end does not negate the meaning of the journey. Does it not? Seraphine asked. What is the point of caring if everything ends? What is the point of building and loving and striving if death eventually erases it all? It was the fundamental question of mortality, the one that had plagued philosophers and poets for as long as language existed. Matthias considered it carefully before answering. The point is the caring itself, he said finally. Not what it accomplishes or how long it lasts, but the simple act of doing it. You built these gardens for me. Someday, decades or centuries from now, they will fall into disuse and decay. The plants will die. The lights will fail. Nothing of this effort will remain. But that does not make it meaningless. It was meaningful in the moment of creation. It is meaningful now as we stand here discussing it. Meaning does not require permanence, Seraphine. It only requires presence. She absorbed this in silence, her crimson eyes distant with thought. Then, I wish I had learned this 300 years ago, when I still had a choice about immortality, when I could have chosen differently. Would you have? Matthias asked. I do not know, she admitted. I wanted power. Wanted to transcend the limitations of mortality. Wanted to be eternal. But I did not understand what I was giving up. Did not realize that in gaining forever I was losing now. That in becoming unchangeable I was becoming unliving. She looked at him directly and he saw tears there again. The ghost tears she could not shed, the emotion without mechanism. If I could choose again, she said, knowing what I know now, I think I would choose mortality. I think I would choose 5 decades of counting days over 5 millennia of timeless existence. Because you are right. Presence matters more than permanence. And I have had 3 centuries of permanence without presence. The admission hung between them, heavy with regret and revelation. Matthias reached out and took her hand, feeling the familiar cold of her skin, the supernatural stillness of her flesh. You cannot change your past, he said gently. But you can change your future. You have learned to feel again. To count. To care. When I am gone, you do not have to return to the way you were. You can continue this. Continue being present. Continue finding mortal things worth caring for even if they end. That is how you honor what we have had together. You speak as if your death is imminent, Seraphine said, a sharp edge entering her voice. Casimir says you have years, possibly a decade with the gardens. Why are you planning your ending when we have barely begun? Because endings come whether we plan for them or not, Matthias replied. And I would rather spend our remaining time preparing you for that reality than pretending it will never arrive. I love you too much to leave you unprepared. I will never be prepared, Seraphine said flatly. How does one prepare for the loss of the first thing they have cared about in 3 centuries? There is no preparation for that. There is only, her voice cracked. There is only the unbearable knowledge that it is coming and the inability to stop it. Matthias pulled her into an embrace. Carefully because she was still so much stronger than him, still capable of crushing him without meaning to. But she returned the embrace with surprising gentleness, her cold arms wrapping around him, her face pressed against his shoulder. I do not want you to die, she whispered, and it was the most honest, unguarded thing she had ever said to him. I do not want to count down to 0. I do not want to exist in a world where you are not in it. And I know that makes me selfish and foolish and pathetically mortal in my thinking, but I cannot help it. I have learned to care, and now I wish I had not, because caring means dreading and I cannot bear it. I know, Matthias said, holding her tighter. I know, and I am sorry. Sorry for teaching you to feel when feeling brings this much pain. Sorry for making you count days that will run out. Sorry for being mortal when you are eternal. Sorry for all of it. Do not apologize, Seraphine said fiercely. She pulled back, looking at him with eyes that blazed with emotion. Do not apologize for being alive. For being mortal. For teaching me what it means to live rather than merely exist. This pain is proof that I am alive too in the only way that matters. And I would rather have this pain than return to the numbness. She touched his face with one cold hand, tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that contradicted her supernatural strength. When you die, she said quietly, when your mortality finally claims you and I am left alone with this newfound ability to feel, I will grieve. I will hurt. I will rage against the unfairness of a universe that allows mortals and immortals to love each other knowing that their endings are asymmetrical. But I will also remember. Remember this. Remember you. Remember that I was capable of loving someone enough to count their days. And you will try, Matthias prompted. You will try to continue living, to find other things worth caring for, to honor what we had by refusing to crystallize again. I will try, Seraphine promised. Though I make no guarantee of success. I'm still learning. Still figuring out how to be this new version of myself. But I will try because you asked me to. Because you believed I was capable of it. Because, she paused and for the first time she said it clearly without deflection or clinical language. Because I love you. And love, apparently, means attempting the impossible. Matthias felt his eyes burn with tears. Real tears, the kind he could actually shed. He let them fall without shame because they were proof of everything they had built together. Proof that an immortal could learn to care and a mortal could be brave enough to teach her. I love you too, he said. And I am so grateful that you let me in. That you took the risk. That you chose vulnerability even though it terrifies you. They held each other in the doorway between the garden and the cavern, between the green growing things and the eternal stone. Two impossible beings who had found each other across the gulf of mortality and immortality, who had learned together what it meant to count days and dread endings and treasure middles. Outside, the Undercroft continued its eternal existence. The candles burned. The mountain stood. The world above spun through seasons. But in that moment time stood still. Not frozen but suspended. Held in the space between breaths, between heartbeats, between the moment of having and the moment of losing. And in that suspension they were perfect. Mortal and immortal. Temporary and eternal. Alive. 3 years, 7 months and 14 days. That was how long Matthias lived in the Undercroft after his recovery. Casimir had predicted 5 years, possibly 10, but the darkness took him faster than expected. Not dramatically, not with sudden crisis, but with the slow erosion of a body trying to exist where it was not meant to exist. The gardens helped. The food they produced sustained him, gave him strength the surface provisions could not. But human bodies need sunlight in ways that go beyond nutrition. They need the warmth, the natural rhythms of day and night, the simple biological fact of existing in an environment designed for mortal life. Without those things, Matthias faded. Not all at once. He remained strong enough to walk, to tend the gardens, to spend his evenings with Seraphine discussing philosophy and poetry and the small observations that comprised their shared life. But there were signs. His skin grew paler. His movements slower. His breathing sometimes labored as if the weight of the mountain pressed on his lungs. Seraphine saw it all. Counted it all. Marked each small degradation with the desperate precision of someone trying to map an inevitable journey. She brought physicians from the surface. Mortal doctors who could examine him without the clinical detachment of vampires. They confirmed what she already knew. He was dying slowly but certainly from the simple fact of living underground. They recommended he return to the surface, to sunlight and fresh air and the natural world. Matthias refused. I have 3 years, 7 months and 14 days with you, he said when she begged him to leave to save himself. Or I have decades on the surface without you. The choice is easy. That is not a choice, Seraphine said, her voice breaking. That is suicide by installments. That is love, Matthias corrected gently. Love means being where the person you love is, even if that place is slowly killing you. I would rather have truncated years with you than a full life without you. So he stayed. And they counted. Every day was marked, noted, treasured. They developed rituals to make time visible. Daily walks through the Undercroft, where Matthias would describe the world above and Seraphine would tell him stories from her long existence. Evening meals in the garden chambers, surrounded by green growing things. Nights spent in the east chambers, talking until Matthias could no longer keep his eyes open, while Seraphine sat vigil beside him, watching him sleep with an expression that was pure human grief on an immortal face. The court adapted to the new reality. Casimir continued his medical examinations, documenting the slow decline with scholarly precision and private heartbreak. Other vampires who had initially viewed Matthias with suspicion or hunger, began to treat him with something approaching respect. He was the mortal who had changed their queen, who had reminded her what it meant to feel. That earned him a kind of reverence, even from creatures who did not fully understand what he had accomplished. In the final weeks, when Matthias could no longer walk to the gardens, Seraphine brought the gardens to him. She had plants transplanted to the east chambers, surrounded his bed with green life so he could wake to leaves and flowers. She read to him when he was too tired to talk. She held his hand for hours, her cold fingers wrapped around his increasingly frail ones, as if she could transfer some of her immortal strength to keep him anchored in life. But mortality does not negotiate. On a day that was like any other day in the Undercroft, no marking of time, no sense of dawn or dusk, Matthias woke and knew it was his last waking. He did not tell Seraphine immediately. He wanted a few more hours of normalcy, a few more moments of presence before the ending. So he asked her to tell him about the first time she had seen a sunrise, back when she was mortal. And she did, her voice steady despite the tears she could not shed, describing the colors and warmth in perfect detail because she knew why he was asking. I saw it from a hillside, she said, her hand tight around his. I was 17. It was the summer solstice. I had walked all night to reach the top before dawn, because I wanted to see the longest day of the year begin. And when the sun finally rose, her voice caught. It was gold and red and orange like the world was catching fire. And I felt warm all the way through. Felt alive. Felt like anything was possible. That sounds beautiful, Matthias said softly. It was, Seraphine agreed. And I have not felt that warmth in 300 years. But these past 3 years with you, she brought his hand to her face, pressed it against her cold cheek. You made me feel warm again. Not physically, but here. She placed his hand over the space where her heart no longer beat. You made me feel alive here. Good, Matthias whispered. That was the point. I know, Seraphine said. And I understand now. I understand why you did this, why you taught me to count and care and grieve. You were right. The pain of this is better than the numbness. The grief I am about to experience is proof that I am still capable of living, even if I cannot die. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his one last time. I will miss you, she said, her voice breaking completely. I will miss you for centuries. For millennia. For as long as this immortal existence continues. And I will honor you by continuing to count. Continuing to care. Continuing to be alive in the way you taught me. Thank you, Matthias said. For letting me in. For taking the risk. For loving me back. Thank you, Seraphine replied, for seeing me, for saving me, for making my eternity meaningful again. Matthias closed his eyes, a small smile on his face. It was my pleasure. Those were his last words. His breathing slowed, steadied, then stopped. His hand went limp in hers. His body relaxed into the stillness that only death brings. And Seraphine, who had not wept in 300 years, who had no mechanism for tears, who had built her entire existence on invulnerability and control. Seraphine broke. She held his body and tried to cry, making sounds that had no words, expressing grief that had no outlet. She bent over him like a willow in a storm, her wings unfurling to wrap around them both, creating a cocoon of darkness around his ending. Casimir found her there hours later, still holding him, still trying to weep without tears. He approached carefully, respectfully, and waited until she acknowledged him. My queen, he said softly. What would you have us do? Seraphine looked up at him, her face a mask of raw pain. He wanted to be buried on the surface. Where things grow. Where the sun can reach him. He told me this weeks ago in case. Her voice failed. We will arrange it, Casimir promised. We will take him to the surface under cover of darkness, bury him where he wished. With honor. With ceremony. With all the respect he is owed. Thank you, Seraphine whispered. She stayed with Matthias's body until the arrangements were made, refusing to leave him even for a moment. When it was time to move him, she carried him herself, cradling his mortal remains with the same gentleness she had shown him in life. They buried him on the southern slope of the mountain, where the first sun of morning would touch his grave. Casimir performed the rites, improvised, cobbled together from half-remembered mortal traditions, but sincere. The entire court attended, standing silent witness to the ending of the mortal who had changed their queen. Seraphine remained after the others returned to the undercroft. She stood beside the fresh grave as the sky began to lighten, as the stars faded and the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. She knew she should retreat. Knew the sun would rise soon, that even this faint light was dangerous for her. But she stayed anyway, needing to see what Matthias had described, what he had given up to be with her in the darkness. The sunrise came slowly, gold and red and orange, painting the sky in colors she had not seen in 3 centuries. The warmth touched her face and for just a moment, just one perfect, impossible moment, she felt alive. Then the burning began. She retreated into shadow, her skin smoking from even that brief contact. But she had seen it, had felt it, had stood in the light one last time because he had wanted her to remember what it was like to be warm. Back in the undercroft, back on her throne, Seraphine sat in the candlelight and the darkness and the eternal stone. Her court watched her with concern, wondering if she would retreat back into the numbness, back into the perfect immortal isolation she had maintained for 3 centuries before Matthias arrived. But she did not. Instead, she stood and addressed her court. "We will continue the gardens," she announced. "We will maintain them. And we will use them to sustain others. Mortals who might pass through our domain, who might need shelter or healing. We will create a place where the living can exist in our darkness, even if only briefly." "My queen?" Casimir asked, uncertain. "He taught me to count days," Seraphine explained. "To value the brief and temporary. To care for things that will end because caring itself has meaning. I will not dishonor that lesson by returning to timelessness. I will count. I will care. I will be alive even in immortality." She looked at her court, at the assembled vampires who had existed for decades or centuries without truly living. "And you will too," she said. "All of you. You will remember what he taught me. That presence matters more than permanence. That feeling is better than numbness. That even eternal beings can learn to live." It was not a suggestion. It was a command. And because she was their queen, they obeyed. The undercroft changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Mortals were allowed passage through the domain, were given shelter in the gardens, were treated with something other than hunger. Vampires began to count again, to mark time, to develop attachments to the brief mortal lives that crossed their paths. Seraphine led them in this transformation, though it cost her dearly. Every mortal she helped, every temporary connection she formed, reminded her of what she had lost. But she persisted because that was what he had asked of her. That was what love demanded, not the cessation of pain, but the acceptance of it as proof of life. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. Seraphine ruled her darkness, but she ruled it differently now. She counted the days of mortals who passed through. She grieved when they left or died. She maintained the gardens with obsessive care, ensuring they thrived as Matthias had wanted them to thrive. And once a year, on the anniversary of his death, she returned to his grave. She would stand at the threshold of her domain, as close to the surface as she dared, and watch the sunrise. She never stayed long enough to burn. Matthias would not have wanted that. But she stayed long enough to feel the warmth, to remember what it was like to be alive, to be seen, to be loved by someone brave enough to teach an immortal how to count. The vampire queen was immortal. She would exist for millennia, untouched by time, unchanged by age. But she was no longer unliving. Because a mortal man had walked into her darkness and taught her that endings give beginnings their weight, that loss proves love was real, that even eternal beings can learn to be alive. She would carry that lesson, and the grief that came with it, forever. And she would treasure both. Because they were proof that once, 3 years, 7 months and 14 days ago, she had been weak. She had been vulnerable. She had been mortal in every way that mattered. And it had been beautiful. In the spaces between darkness and light, between eternal and temporary, between invulnerable and open, that is where we become most human. That is where we learn what it means to live. Not forever. Not perfectly. But truly.